So today we're going to talk about The Magic Mountain, which is an amazing novel written by the German writer Thomas Mann. The Magic Mountain was first published in 1924 and it is considered one of the best and most influential books of the 20th century. The world of The Magic Mountain is that of the lead up to World War I, and I think it is important to bear in mind that Thomas Mann began writing this novel in the run-up to the war, but actually finished it during the war. I think it is also important that you have that historical context in mind as you read The Magic Mountain. Another thing I recommend to anyone who wants to read or perhaps reread The Magic Mountain would be to read Thomas Mann's novella Death in Venice first. Thomas Mann's original intention in writing The Magic Mountain was to write an ironic follow-up to his novella from 1912. And there are so many connections between both works of fiction, and I consider both to be, in fact, two sides of the same coin. The Magic Mountain is the flip side of Death in Venice and vice versa. By the way, if you want to know more about Death in Venice, I've also reviewed it here on my channel, and you can find a link to that review in the description for this video. Okay, but let's just talk now about some of the connections between The Magic Mountain and Death in Venice. Now, both stories share close spaces as their main settings: a hotel in Death in Venice, a hotel in Venice, obviously, and a sanatorium in The Magic Mountain. Although open spaces also feature in both stories, of course. There's the city of Venice in the novella and the Alps in the novel. And we move from the coastal plains in northern Italy to the mountains of Davos in Switzerland. Okay, I think the war, World War I, changed everything in the writing of this novel. Mann stopped writing the novel at the outbreak of the war, and only finished it a few years after the war had ended. As you know, World War I lasted between mid-1914 and late 1918, and The Magic Mountain was only published in 1924, so just a few years after the end of the war. Now, Thomas Mann published The Magic Mountain during the Weimar Republic, which was a democratic experiment in Germany that unfortunately failed with the rise of Nazism, as you know. Now, Thomas Mann went into exile then and possibly became the loudest intellectual voice of dissent against Nazi Germany. And I think that alone should make anybody want to read his writing. Now, another fascinating thing about Thomas Mann is that he became a German language anti-Nazi broadcaster during World War II. So after he wrote The Magic Mountain. So in his own way, he fought against the horrors of Nazi Germany. Now, Thomas Mann lived in the United States from 1939 until his death in 1955. He even became naturalized in the 1940s. During his lifetime, and this is also fascinating, Thomas Mann was a celebrity. It might sound strange to us that an intellectual of his caliber could possibly become a celebrity. That's not something that would happen now, but in the 20th century, that was still possible. So Thomas Mann was famous worldwide during his lifetime. So he's not one of those writers whose work only becomes famous and acclaimed after their death. Far from it. Thomas Mann was what we could call a public intellectual. I think that if he were alive now, no doubt he would be all over Twitter and Instagram, sharing his opinions on the state of the world, politics, arts, anything really. I mean, that's actually what he did when he was still alive. Obviously, social media didn't exist yet back then in the 1940s, 50s. But Thomas Mann used not only his writing, you know, books like The Magic Mountain, but also any other outlets, including at the time, radio, to express his opinion on a wide range of issues. And remember that he lived through both world wars and also the beginning of the Cold War. So there was certainly no shortage of topics for him to discuss. Now, Thomas Mann also gave lectures, he wrote essays, and I have to confess, I've only started with his fiction this year, and I want to continue with it next year in 2021, but at some point I would like to approach his non-fiction writing. Now, Thomas Mann was the winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1929. Back then, writers won the Nobel Prize for one book and not for the whole for their work as a whole, as they do now. In Mann's case, he won the prize for his first novel, Buddenbrooks, which had been originally published in 1901 and which is heavily autobiographical, apparently. I haven't read it yet, but together with Dr. Faustus, The Buddenbrooks is one of the next novels by Thomas Mann I intend to read. These two are the next few novels by Thomas Mann I want to read. So I'm just trying to give you an idea of the dimension of Thomas Mann's work and the importance he had not only as a fictionist, as a fiction writer, but also as an intellectual during his lifetime. And I hope I'm conveying that. Thomas Mann's novels can be overwhelming not only because of their sheer length, but also because of all the cultural references that he pours into them. And The Magic Mountain is possibly the best example of this. So I would recommend approaching his short stories and novellas first, particularly Death in Venice, which I think is the perfect companion piece to The Magic Mountain. Anyway, and also Tonio Kröger, which is a great novella in its own right, which is included in this collection that I own. So only approach The Magic Mountain when you think you're ready for it, but don't be put off by it. When I say ready, I mean make sure that you're going to be able to give it proper attention and time, because I think there's no point trying to rush through a towering work of genius such as this, right? So The Magic Mountain is a novel about a world that doesn't exist anymore. What world is this? The European world of this novel collapsed because of World War I. And that makes me think of actually another book, very different book, which I think is actually a lot more accessible by another German language writer, which is The World of Yesterday by the Austrian writer Stefan Zweig, which is a book I would actually recommend to everyone, okay? I have the Spanish language edition here, but it's also available in English. Stefan Zweig goes one step further than Mann because he's able to do that because he wrote later, and he had already seen some of the horrors of the rise of Nazism when he wrote his book. Now, The Magic Mountain covers some of the same ground, but stops at World War I. However, its first German readers lived through the Weimar Republic, and the novel continued to be read, and in fact continues to be read to this day. So now let's talk about the novel itself without any spoilers, you know. Seasoned viewers of my channel, Bookish Islander, know that I never spoil the plot of the books I review. So here we go. Well, the main character in The Magic Mountain is Hans Castorp. He's a young man who, upon becoming an engineer and before joining the family business in the busy port city of Hamburg in northern Germany, decides to join his cousin Joachim Siemssen at a sanatorium for tuberculosis in Davos, Switzerland. And that is where the novel takes place, right? So Joachim, Hans' cousin, has TB, and that's why he's at the sanatorium. But Hans Castorp himself is healthy. You know, he only goes up the mountain to see his cousin and spend some time with him, keep him company, just for a few weeks. Well, actually, Hans ends up spending 7 years at the sanatorium, and that is a narrative time of the novel, 7 years here in all these pages. And time is also important, it's crucial in fact. In German, they say that The Magic Mountain, it's a Zeitroman, or a novel about time. Zeitromans are about the present time, the time when they are written. And I think The Magic Mountain is the only novel of this kind I have read, but as I gradually explore German literature, which is something I mean to do in the next few years, I expect I will read more Zeitromans. Well, now, how Thomas Mann deals with time in this book is probably more important than the plot. For instance, the first 100 pages or so of The Magic Mountain only cover the first day, just one day, the first day of Hans Castorp's stay at the sanatorium. But then the whole novel manages to cover 7 years, right? The sanatorium here also works as a microcosm of European high society. Rich people from different European countries and other countries in the world actually go there to the sanatorium for treatment. And that's another important element of the novel that I wanted to highlight. Now, death is one of the main themes and one of the connections with the earlier Death in Venice, of course. Now, in The Magic Mountain, all the characters are sick. Even Hans Castorp eventually gets sick. He initially thinks he's healthy and his stay at the sanatorium would be brief, but ends up, as we see, staying for almost a decade up there. Now, the treatment for TB at the time was mainly resting, eating healthily, staying somewhere up high where there is dry, rarefied air. Now, in a context like this of constant resting, you would be a fool to expect a lot of action from this book, and there is almost none of it in The Magic Mountain. What you have instead are long, intelligent conversations between the patients on everything. Everything is everything. Music, politics, art, philosophy, and along, etc. And there is also a love affair between Hans Castorp and another patient. But I don't want to go into that because the best way to find out about that and anything else in the plot would be for you to read the novel. But I think Castorp needed a reason to stay there at the sanatorium for such a long time. And while there are other reasons, his love affair is the main one that makes him stay up the mountain, I think. Now, time is suspended up in the Magic Mountain, up on the mountain. If you think about it, time only makes sense if you work or study, but the patients have no such occupations. All they must focus on is resting. They live in an extremely privileged bubble in the sanatorium. They don't need to work. They have plenty of money to pay for everything they need. And remember that Hans is delaying starting to work, right? First for a few weeks, then for 7 years. He had just become an engineer before going up the mountain and was supposed to start working upon his return, which was meant to happen only within a few weeks. Only that he keeps delaying his return and stays up in the sanatorium for 7 years, thus delaying joining the world of work. Now, there is also a distance between the world elites up in the sanatorium and people who have normal lives, and that distance is symbolized here by the mountain. Now, the characters in the novel are not just far away from the rest of the world, from people like you and me, but they are also high above us, high above the world, both literally and figuratively. It is extremely hard to make this novel justice, to do this novel justice in a short video review, but I hope that you take away the importance it has and what to expect from it, more or less. Enough at least to make you decide whether you should read it or not, and sure, I would say you should read it.